So, as you can tell by the tinny version of Mr. Raine's iPhone, that we are looking today at the second half of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
For those of you keeping track at home, this is Julio Iglesias, one of the more famous Cuban-American singers of, let's say, the last 40 years, singing Guantanamera. You may know his son better, Enrique Iglesias, who sang numerous hits, including some Bailamos, Let the Rhythm Kick You Over, Bailamos. I do love this song, Guantanamera. It means the girl from Guantanamo. It's wonderful.
Okay, so
Guantanamera.
We've just wasted a minute of their life. We're not getting that time back. Okay. So, if you recall, we left the story at the tentative cliffhanger where the US U-2 spy planes, remember those guys? They have just spotted the missiles being built in Cuba and that they'll be active within a matter of months. The USA needs to react.
Now that we're done here and the music has stopped owning me, one of the things you need to consider, I guess, is the fact that the U.S. has a lot of options. Obviously, this is a very, very, very provocative threat to U.S. national security.
Well, I mean,
let's be honest. The United States had done it first, but nevertheless, this was in their backyard. The first time this happens, perhaps, the first time you're threatened directly on your borders, perhaps, let's just say, it was a profoundly scary thing. And what happens is a 13-day crisis evolves. And this is really the hot point of the Cold War, the point when nuclear war seemed and was believed by many millions of Americans and many millions of Russians to be just about imminent. President Kennedy learns of the missiles, and he sets up a committee made up of 12 advisors. Of course, this committee is largely dominated by his brother Robert Kennedy, a very, very, very intelligent man himself.
An interesting thing about these advisors is, although there's military advisors, it had been the same military advisors who had told him to the Bay of Pigs. And there's a whole thing that says, actually, because of the Bay of Pigs, the president learned not to trust the military advisors and actually decided to trust his own judgment and Robert more. So whereas he basically deferred to what the military advisors said in the Bay of Pigs, and it was a disaster, he will go across a chart course which turns out to be more successful. The military advisors are going to advise him to do option number 1 and option number 2, which, as you can imagine, won't end well for the world.
Yeah, so basically the options are put on the table, this gang of 12, and they're discussed for a very, very long time. The options are fivefold. The first one, of course, is to bomb Cuba and to also simultaneously bomb the Soviet Union using nuclear missiles, develop that first strike, wipe them off the map, and then be hopeful that they don't
move.
Yeah, be hopeful that they destroy all of the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union can retaliate. Option number 2, which actually may lead to option number 1, is of course to have a U.S.-led invasion of Cuba, get rid of the Russians and get rid of the Cubans once and for all. Basically, the Bay of Pigs only times 1 million with the American soldiers leading the operation. Number 3 is to use an airstrike to destroy the bases, which of course could lead to 1 and or 2 needing to be happened as retaliation, depending on the retaliation of the Soviet Union.
And they would be forced to retaliate because Soviets are at this missile site and they will be killed as a result of this.
Yeah. And number 4 was to blockade Cuba, to effectively prevent ships and supplies from reaching it. So an island nation can be starved or have its access to the vital resources it needs to continue on completely cut off. They can't export and sell their goods, their economy will suffer, they can't get food in, their people will suffer. This may force the hands of the Cubans to negotiate with the Americans and move forward. And then I suppose the last option is always on the table, is just to accept it and do nothing.
So, the options are there. As mentioned before, Kennedy goes against the advice of his military cabinet for the first 3, which are seen as too provocative, but instead go for the 4th one. The 5th one is just will destroy his reputation internationally. He can't do it. The blockade is useful because A, it buys time. The ships are still a number of weeks out, so it gives him time to negotiate. The blockade is also useful because he can show it to look strong without being an aggressor. For example, if I'm sat next to Mr. Raine, if I punch Mr. Raine in the face, obviously he'll be knocked out in one blow by my mighty punch. But if I punch him, that's more of an aggression to say, Mr. Raine, if you come any closer, then I'm going to have to stop you. Okay, obviously the blockade, I still forced, I still stopped Mr. Raine from getting to my books, but at the same time, I look less of an aggressor. So they decide to do the blockade, or what they describe as a quarantine, because a blockade is technically illegal under international law. So for the quarantine, if you call it a different name, that's fine. This is actually the brilliant idea, if you look for those to look at the A-star, to show off, of Robert McNamara, who is the big sort of dove of the sort of XCOM, not the game, by the way, XCOM, the XCOM sort of meeting of advisors to Kennedy. And so what they decide...
Sorry. So McNamara is the Secretary of State.
Absolutely, which is our sort of equivalent of, well, foreign minister, isn't it? Like, sort of like foreign minister of the interior.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah, but basically the foreign minister, I suppose. Yeah.
So what they decide to do is that the sort of radius around Cuba will be guarded. Now, in reality, they know where the ships are. They've got the intelligence. They've got the satellites. They know it. They put a fleet of submarines on alert, and 156 ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, i.e. the ones that can fire from wherever and hit wherever, were ready. The Air Force bombers put on alert and put in the air 24 hours a day to patrol the sea, and the soldiers are placed on combat alert. Now, all of this serves two purposes. If it all goes south, you're ready to fight back. But this is as much about showing that you're serious than it is about actually being ready to fight. Because in reality, the soldiers, for example, the soldiers being placed on combat alert, everyone's going to be dead anyway if it all goes south. So what's the point? But if you do all of this, you're showing this is the blockade and we mean business. If you say blockade but don't enforce it, then obviously people are going to go through it.
Now, all of this is done in the sort of, I guess, brought to people's attention via their living room through television, which is now pretty much in every American home. One of the things that really makes the Cuban Missile Crisis stand out is the fact that everybody in the country, that is the United States, and by extension the world, really shared in the tension. What was going to happen here? And Kennedy makes a very famous television address on the 22nd of October. Since he could not directly communicate with Khrushchev, their diplomatic ties, of course, were long severed, and that any sort of communication would have to go through back channels, that have to go through foreign offices. They would take too long. And this is a crisis that demanded immediate communication with the other side. Kennedy decides that he will, using television, broadcast an address to the American people that directly addresses and directly talks to Nikita Khrushchev. Kennedy knows that Khrushchev will get a copy of this. He will see it. They're tapping, they're spying on American TV. Khrushchev will see this in almost real time and be forced to respond. So Kennedy goes on TV and he warns Nikita Khrushchev that the Soviet convoy, and there was a large contingent of Soviet ships heading for Cuba, then that was many of these ships were carrying nuclear weapons to be placed in Cuba, would not be permitted. And he says this convoy, when it approaches our quarantine around Cuba, will not be permitted to pass the blockade. In other words, if you try and run the blockade, we will sink your ships, an act of war. So very much he draws his line in the sand. He says, if you cross this with your ships carrying nuclear weapons to your friends in Cuba, we will attack you.
So it's a real sort of brinkmanship, the idea of like being so firm, because he said it to the public. He can't really that easily go back on that.
And it's also important to know that his term full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union means more than sinking their ships. It means that if those ships cross the line, those ships will be sunk, but also literally hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons will be launched instantaneously at the Soviet Union with the purpose of wiping it off the map.
So, what does Khrushchev decide to do? As the world holds its breath as the ships get closer and closer and closer, Khrushchev's got a choice. Do I plough through and call Kennedy's bluff? That's escalating the brinkmanship. Or do I turn around? Now, Khrushchev, and this is why I would argue Khrushchev is the man who's a little bit more reasonable and wants to get world peace. Because Khrushchev is just as able to nuke and kill everyone in America as America is able to kill everyone in Russia. Now, that's the whole point of this. Like, Khrushchev still has ICBMs, still has bombers. Like, the whole thing about the nuclear bombs in Cuba don't really matter that much. It makes it slightly easier to nuke America, but not that big, really. Anyway, Khrushchev decides on the 24th of October, to stop the sort of Soviet ships just before they reached Blockade. He doesn't say publicly at this point he's never going to supply them, but what this does is it buys time, and it shows winning, it shows goodwill. As well as this, though, Kennedy also detects it shows that perhaps Kennedy's got a stronger negotiating position. So Kennedy then demands removal of all missiles, and then says the failure to do so would lead to an invasion of Cuba. This is provocative, I would argue. I'm not a massive fan of Kennedy personally, and this always comes across every time I teach this course, but Kennedy is playing the Brinkman, playing the sort of hardcore line quite hard, in which Khrushchev is ready to keep the status quo. So what happens next is fairly interesting.
So on the 26th of October, Khrushchev sends Kennedy a letter, and he offers in this letter to remove the missiles if the blockade is removed, in other words, that the United States stops their quarantine of Cuba, and they make a promise not to invade. What gets a little bit interesting here, because Khrushchev is seemingly under the influence of other people.
He's feeling pressure.
Yeah, there are a lot of people in the Soviet Politburo, the group that runs the Soviet Union, and this, of course, led by Khrushchev, who are hardliners, old Stalinists, who want Khrushchev to play the game of brinksmanship as hard as Kennedy is playing. Khrushchev, on the other hand, is a little bit more pragmatic. He does not necessarily probably want invasion to happen whatsoever. So what happens in the days of the 26th and 27th of October becomes quite confusing. The letter where he says he will remove the missiles if the blockade is removed and a promise to invade is made is received on the 26th. On the 27th, a tougher letter is ostensibly sent by Khrushchev, where he promises to remove the missiles if the USA remove theirs from Turkey. There is a little bit of, I don't know, how do we say, confusion, especially amongst Kennedy, about who is actually pushing the buttons in the Soviet Union.
It's important to realize that, like, Khrushchev survived 2 coup attempts. A coup is when the army tries to take over. By this point already, since his premiership, one in 56, one in 59, which is like less important. But essentially, Khrushchev is a man who is not necessarily in control at this point. He's being pushed, and that makes him more unreliable. Kennedy thinks he can beat Khrushchev, but not the hardliners who can behind him.
And interestingly enough, another U.S. spy plane is shot down over Cuba on the day of the October 27th. And the pilot dies, and which leads to an even worsening of tension. So it's leading to believe that Khrushchev, despite his overtures of peace and doing these things, might be prepared to run the blockade and lead himself.
And the spy plane really presents a problem, because if it gets out, the American public will want revenge of some description. And that will almost force Kennedy, even if he doesn't want to escalate. And Kennedy doesn't want nuclear war, he's just prepared to push it further. But even he recognises the spy plane is really not a good thing. So what he decides to do is not tell people about the spy plane straight away. And actually, what happens is, with the suggestion of his brother, Kennedy accepts the first letter and ignores the second one. You remember the first letter being the one which basically says, don't blockade, and we won't put nuclear missiles there. Like the real give-in one.
Yeah.
And so what he does is he publicly accepts it and says, I got this letter that you gave me, and this is what completely ignoring the second one, and says, obviously if you don't respond, we will invade. Khrushchev now, his hand has been forced. It's quite a sneaky move to some extent. And he accepts the offer publicly. Now, behind the scenes, in order to sweeten the deal, the USA agrees to get rid of the missiles from Turkey. And this really helps, make sure Khrushchev agrees to it. But the really thing that Khrushchev mucks up on is that remains secret. So if you're someone watching this crisis, what's happened is Khrushchev has basically given in, and Kennedy has forced Khrushchev to accept that, you know what, stop taking nuclear bombs. And Kennedy has given nothing. Now, in reality, actually, what's happened is
Kennedy has removed the missiles from Turkey.
And you removed missiles from Cuba. Fantastic, everyone wins. But the failure to get that public makes it look like Khrushchev has lost. And obviously, when the U-2 spy, when the shot shooting down the U-2 spy plane comes out, it is a little bit like, in that piece, there's an agreement's been made, it's less of a big deal, and also it was very much blamed on the Cubans rather than the Russians, even though it was the Russians' weapons and Russian soldiers, but we ignore that. So what ends up happening is this resolves to some extent, the crisis.
So, in the end, because, of course, the fact that the missiles being removed from Turkey were kept secret, Kennedy looks like the big winner. He's acclaimed at home and actually worldwide as a great statesman, a hero who saved peace. And this is largely because his major concession, the fact that the United States would remove the missiles from Turkey, wasn't known. It was kept a secret from everybody. It wasn't made public. And it looked like the United States had just effectively bullied him. Khrushchev, on the other hand, appears humiliated. The Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong criticizes him for backing down. And Khrushchev himself is sacked in 1964 and will spend the remainder of his life under house arrest, not able to leave his property until the day he died. A sort of punishment for backing down. It's a real success, but it does have, and I suppose, even though it was very clear escalation intentions of the Cold War, does have some very long-lasting effects, which in the long term can be argued that the Cuban Missile Crisis, although it increases tension, decreases tension in the long term. Communications improved. Remember, one of the big issues in Kennedy having to go on TV and the sending of letters is it's really slow. And when things are in a crisis point, you need instant communications. They set up a system whereby leaders could directly communicate with each other rather than rely on letters or the TV. They established a telephone link, sometimes known as the Red Phone. I think it's because you pick it up and call it the Red Communists. There was no such thing as a Red Phone, but it sort of gets that nickname. And there was a direct link. So if Khrushchev wanted to talk to Kennedy or Brezhnev wanted to talk to, I don't know, Gerald Ford in the 1970s, all they had to do was pick up the Red Phone. They could get direct telephone communications with each other.
I won't mention that one. I was looking up quotes of Mao Zedong for my book, and they're full of swear words about Khrushchev. So I'll leave that to one side.
He uses the term dog poopy?
Yes, he does, amongst others. So it's quite glowing terms. Mao never did things by halves. So there was an increase in communication. As well as that, there was this sort of feeling of, whoa, that escalated quickly. And so there was this new urge to try to limit the likelihood of nuclear war through various nuclear treaties. Now, in reality, these treaties, and you are going to soon be sick of treaties, but this is the start of a wonderful road of regret, which for you guys. But these treaties don't necessarily mean a lot. They don't mean anything really to stop nuclear war, but they show goodwill. The idea that we want things to improve. And as any relationship counsel will tell you, that's the first step to recovery. So they signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, where they agreed not to test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. They can do it underground or whatever. As well as that, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Non-proliferation basically means let's not give it to other countries, because it makes it even more random if we have sort of
And I suppose the danger is if you have a lot of people who you can't trust or you don't know too well with nuclear weapons, the likelihood of people who are potentially unstable or don't understand the larger geopolitical consequences may use these weapons in an act of aggression that threatens the security of the world.
Think North Korea. Again, this does not stop the chance of nuclear war, and in reality, it tends to get worse. But it shows that there's an intention, there's a willingness to try and improve things and get things quite good. And therefore, all of this combines this. Oh God, that really went bad. That encourages this urge to try and get relations to improve. There's a gradual warning of relations where the US sells grain to the USSR due to the grain shortage.
Really, truly a symbolic gesture.
Oh yeah.
We see that you have a shortage of grain. We will help feed your people. This is a nice thing that we're doing. Let's make things better.
Actually, right. And then shortly, don't get confused though, because shortly later, USSR will be selling grain to the US in a similarly symbolic gesture of here's some money. But big thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest it came to war, all that does is it sort of forces both sides to really want to try and row back from that. And although there'll be an escalation of tensions again in the 1980s, they never really come to the same level of paranoia that there is at this period. I mean, obviously there's times when, for example, Flock of Gulls will alarm in a station, they'll almost start a nuclear war, or a bear will climb over a fence and there'll almost be a nuclear war. But that's not the same thing. That's more like an accent of the lower level. This is not a battle between leaders, which we see here.
Good. So that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. a short period in October 1962 where, for many people, thought that the world would end up being destroyed in a nuclear war.
What's the film on this? It's like
13 days.
13 days.
13 days.
There's a film out, which is all right.
Yeah, it's actually pretty good, but and it does follow chronologically what's going on. It's a worthy watch.
I think it must be on YouTube. It's that quite old film.
Yeah, it probably is. Well, we'll see if we can get it to you. Anyways, I'm Mr. Raine.
And Mr. Suter.
Take care.